Ancient civilizations that disappeared without explanation. Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding your city empty. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just silence. Buildings intact, streets abandoned, everything left behind as if people simply vanished into thin air. Now imagine that on the scale of an entire civilization. Millions of people, sophisticated cities, complex societies, all gone. And no one knows why. This isn't science fiction. It's happened multiple times throughout human history. Advanced civilizations have risen, flourished for centuries or even millennia, and then collapsed so completely that we can barely piece together what happened. Some left behind magnificent ruins and tantalizing clues. Others disappeared so thoroughly that we only discovered them in the last century. All of them pose the same haunting question: what happened to these people? Today, we're going to explore 5 of the most mysterious vanished civilizations in human history. We're talking about societies that built incredible cities, developed sophisticated technologies, created art and writing and culture, and then disappeared. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the world's oldest urban cultures, with cities more advanced than ancient Rome, abandoned without explanation. The classic Maya, who built towering pyramids and developed complex mathematics and astronomy, whose cities were swallowed by jungle. Göbekli Tepe, a massive stone temple complex built by people who supposedly didn't have civilization yet, then deliberately buried and forgotten. The Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders who brought down empires across the Mediterranean, then vanished from history as suddenly as they appeared. And Easter Island, where people carved nearly 1,000 giant stone heads, then saw their society collapse in isolation. These aren't myths or legends. These are real civilizations, documented by archaeology, confirmed by science. And their disappearances remain among the greatest mysteries in human history. What caused these collapses? War, disease, climate change, internal conflict, or something else entirely? The answers might tell us something crucial about our own civilization. Because if it happened to them societies that seemed permanent, powerful, and advanced, what's to stop it from happening to us? Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're rewatching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy history and mystery videos like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Chapter 1: The Indus Valley Civilization. Introduction to the Indus Valley. Let's start with a civilization so advanced, so sophisticated, that when archaeologists first discovered it in the 1920s, they couldn't believe how old it was. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization, flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwest India from approximately 3300 BCE to 1300 BCE. That makes it one of the 3 oldest civilizations in the world, contemporary with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. But here's what makes it remarkable. At its peak around 2600 BCE, the Indus Valley Civilization was larger and more populous than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It covered an area of 1.5 million square kilometers, roughly the size of Western Europe. It had a population estimated at 5 million people, living in more than 1,000 settlements. And we barely knew it existed until 100 years ago. Unlike Egypt with its pyramids or Mesopotamia with its ziggurats, the Indus Valley Civilization left no massive monuments that screamed for attention. Their cities were buried under millennia of sediment, hidden beneath modern towns and agricultural fields. When archaeologists finally excavated them, what they found was astonishing. The cities and technology. The 2 major cities we've excavated are Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. And calling them advanced doesn't do them justice. These cities were planned. Not organic growth like medieval towns, but deliberately designed with grid layouts, uniform brick sizes, and sophisticated infrastructure. Streets ran north-south and east-west in perfect grids. Buildings were made from standardized fired bricks, millions of them, all the same size. But it's the infrastructure that really impresses. Every house, even the smallest, had access to fresh water through a sophisticated well system. More importantly, every house had a bathroom with a drain that connected to a city-wide sewage system. Think about that. 5,000 years ago, the average home in Mohenjo-Daro had better sanitation than many homes in the world today. The sewage system was covered, meaning the streets weren't open sewers like they would be in European cities 4,000 years later. The drains had inspection holes for maintenance. They even had settling chambers where solid waste would separate from water. This level of urban planning wouldn't be seen again in human history until the Romans, 3,000 years later. The cities had public baths. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro is larger than most modern swimming pools, with a sophisticated system for filling and draining. They had granaries for food storage. They had standardized weights and measures used across the entire civilization. They had multi-story buildings. They had trash collection systems with bins at regular intervals. They had wide streets that could accommodate wheeled vehicles. The Indus people traded extensively. We found their seals carved stone stamps used to mark goods as far away as Mesopotamia. They traded cotton textiles, jewelry, pottery, and metals. They had a writing system, still undeciphered, with about 400 symbols. They created art bronze sculptures, pottery decorated with geometric designs, jewelry made from gold, silver, and precious stones. The famous dancing girl bronze statue from Mohenjo-Daro is as sophisticated as anything produced in the ancient world. And here's something remarkable. We find almost no evidence of warfare. No defensive walls around cities, no weapons in large quantities. No depictions of battles or military leaders in their art, no clear evidence of a ruling class or monarchy. The Indus Valley civilization appears to have been relatively egalitarian. Houses varied in size, but not dramatically. There are no palaces, no temples, no obvious seats of power. It seems to have been governed through some form of collective decision-making rather than kings or emperors. For over 1,000 years, this civilization thrived, stable and prosperous, more advanced in many ways than its contemporaries. And then it disappeared. The mysterious collapse. Around 1900 BCE, something changed. The cities began to decline. By 1300 BCE, they were abandoned. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was a gradual disintegration that took centuries. But the end result was the same. One of the world's greatest civilizations simply faded away. What happened? This is where it gets mysterious. Because we have plenty of theories, but no smoking gun, no definitive answer. And because we can't read their writing, we don't have their own accounts of what went wrong. Let's look at the theories. Theory 1. Aryan invasion. For decades, the prevailing theory was that Indo-Aryan peoples invaded from Central Asia, conquering or displacing the Indus people. This was based partly on linguistic evidence. Sanskrit and other Indo-European languages did arrive in South Asia around this time, and partly on finding human remains at Mohenjo-Daro that suggested violence. But this theory has fallen out of favor. The timeline doesn't match. The Indus cities were already declining before any proposed invasion. The skeletal evidence is now interpreted differently. Those bodies were from a later period, possibly victims of disease or malnutrition during the decline, not warfare. There's no archaeological evidence of mass violence or conquest. No burned cities, no wholesale destruction, no sudden cultural replacement. Theory 2. Climate change and environmental collapse. This is now considered the most likely explanation, though it's more complex than a simple drought. Climate data shows that around 2200 to 1900 BCE, the Indian monsoon weakened significantly. This was part of a larger climate event called the 4.2 kiloyear event, which caused droughts and disruptions across much of the ancient world. The weakened monsoon meant less rainfall. Rivers that fed the Indus cities began to dry up or change course. The Gagarhakkar River, which may be the lost Sarasvati River mentioned in ancient texts, apparently dried up during this period. With less water, agriculture suffered, crop yields dropped. The surplus that allowed urban life to flourish disappeared. People couldn't support large cities anymore, but it wasn't just drought. The Indus people had deforested large areas for fuel and building materials. This caused soil erosion, making agriculture even more difficult. The combination of climate change and human environmental degradation created a perfect storm. Theory 3: River changes and flooding. Some evidence suggests the opposite problem: too much water. Tectonic activity may have altered river courses, causing catastrophic flooding in some areas. We see thick layers of silt at some sites, suggesting massive floods buried parts of cities. The Indus River itself may have changed course, leaving some cities without reliable water access while flooding others. Theory 4: Disease. Some researchers point to evidence of declining health in the later period. Skeletal remains show signs of malnutrition, infectious disease, and stress. Perhaps a plague swept through the population, or chronic disease weakened the civilization. But this raises a chicken and egg question. Did disease cause the collapse, or did the collapse from other causes lead to malnutrition and disease? Theory 5: Trade disruption. The Indus civilization depended on long-distance trade. When the cities of Mesopotamia experienced their own problems around the same time the 4.2 kiloyear event affected them, two trade networks collapsed. Without trade, the economic basis of Indus urbanism might have failed. What really happened? The truth is probably a combination of all these factors. Climate change stressed the civilization. Environmental degradation made recovery difficult. Rivers changing course disrupted some cities. Trade networks failed. Disease spread through malnourished populations. Social and political systems that had maintained order for centuries broke down. This is what archaeologists call a systems collapse, when multiple interconnected problems reinforce each other, creating a cascade of failures that the society can't recover from. But here's what makes the Indus collapse distinctive. It was peaceful and gradual. The people didn't die en masse, they moved, they dispersed. As the cities became unsustainable, people migrated. Some moved east into the Ganges Valley, others moved south. They took their knowledge, their culture, their technologies with them. They didn't disappear in the sense of extinction, they transformed. The urban civilization collapsed, but the people and many aspects of their culture survived. Elements of Indus culture, pottery styles, agricultural techniques, possibly religious practices show up in later Indian cultures. It was a deurbanization rather than an extinction. The cities died, but the people lived on in smaller, rural communities. This is actually visible in the archaeological record. The later phases of Indus sites show declining urban features, less sophisticated architecture, less uniformity in pottery, simpler tools. It's a civilization reverting to village life. But here asks the haunting question. These people built one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations in ancient history. They mastered city planning, hydraulic engineering, and large-scale organization. They maintained this for over 1,000 years, and then they lost it. That knowledge, that capability to build great cities with advanced infrastructure it took centuries to redevelop in South Asia. Why couldn't they adapt? Why couldn't they solve the environmental and climate problems with their obvious engineering skills? Maybe the problems were too big. Maybe the social structures that allowed collective action broke down. Maybe the population pressure was too high. Maybe they'd pushed their environment beyond a tipping point. Or maybe they did adapt by choosing to abandon urban life. Maybe rural, village-based existence was actually the rational response to the changing conditions. Maybe the collapse of cities wasn't a failure, but a successful adaptation to a new reality. We'll never know for certain. The Indus script remains undeciphered. We don't have their voices, their explanations, their perspective on what happened. What we do know is that 5,000 years ago, millions of people lived in well-planned cities with running water and sophisticated infrastructure. They created a stable, prosperous civilization that endured for over a millennium, and then they walked away from it all. Chapter 2: The Maya Collapse. The classic Maya civilization. Now let's travel to Central America, to the jungles of Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico, where another great civilization rose and fell. The Maya civilization spans 3,000 years and still exists today. There are millions of Maya people living in Mexico and Central America. But we're going to focus on a specific period, the classic Maya period, roughly to 50 CE to 900 CE, and one of history's most mysterious events, the classic Maya collapse. First, let's understand what the classic Maya achieved, because it was extraordinary. The Maya built massive stone cities in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemalan lowlands have thin soil, dense jungle, and no rivers. Most civilizations build along rivers, water for drinking, irrigation for crops, transportation for trade. The Maya had none of that. Instead, they built elaborate systems to collect and store rainwater. They constructed reservoirs, aqueducts, and filtration systems. At Tikal, one of the largest Maya cities, they engineered a water management system that served tens of thousands of people in the heart of the jungle. The cities themselves were magnificent. Tikal had pyramids over 200 feet tall. Calakmul, El Mirador, Copan, Palenque, these weren't small settlements. These were urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, surrounded by agricultural zones supporting even more people. The total population of the Maya civilization at its peak may have exceeded 10 million people. That's roughly equivalent to the entire Roman Empire at the same time, but in a much smaller area. The Maya developed one of only 5 fully developed writing systems in human history. Their hieroglyphic script encoded their language completely. They could write anything they could say. They carved texts on stone monuments called stelae, painted them in books called codices, inscribed them on pottery and buildings. We can read Maya writing now, which gives us something we don't have for the Indus Valley, their own words. We know their kings' names, their dynastic histories, their wars and alliances. We can read their dates, their astronomical observations, their ritual practices. And that's the other thing. Maya astronomy and mathematics were incredibly sophisticated. They had a concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in Europe. They developed multiple interlocking calendar systems that tracked time with astonishing precision. They predicted eclipses, tracked the movements of Venus, and recorded astronomical data spanning centuries. They built all of this without metal tools, without the wheel for transport. They had wheeled toys, but didn't use wheels for practical purposes, without draft animals. Everything was done with stone tools, human labor, and mathematical precision. The classic Maya civilization represented one of the highest achievements of pre-Columbian America. Dozens of city-states, each with its own ruling dynasty, engaged in trade, warfare, and diplomacy. They created sophisticated art jade carvings, painted pottery, elaborate murals. They developed complex religious and philosophical systems. For 6 centuries, this civilization thrived, growing more complex and sophisticated over time. And then, in less than a century, most of the southern lowland cities were abandoned. The collapse begins. The collapse didn't happen everywhere at once. It rolled through the Maya heartland like a slow-motion wave of devastation. It started around 800 CE. Cities in the southern lowlands, the area that is now northern Guatemala and Belize, began to show signs of stress. Monument construction slowed. the long count calendar dates that kings carved on stelae to commemorate their reigns became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. The last dated monument at Tikal was carved in 869 CE at Köpen, 822 CE at Palenque, 799 CE city after city fell silent. Population plummeted. Archaeological surveys show that the southern lowlands lost perhaps 85 to 90% of their population over the 9th century. We're talking about millions of people. The great cities were abandoned. Jungle reclaimed the plazas and pyramids. Within a few generations, the massive urban centers that had dominated the landscape for centuries were buried under vegetation, forgotten. But here's what's crucial. This wasn't a collapse of Maya civilization entirely. Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and other northern centers actually grew during this period, possibly absorbing refugees from the south. And Maya people didn't vanish. The population of the southern lowlands dropped drastically, but people continued living in smaller settlements. When the Spanish arrived 600 years later, they encountered millions of Maya people in dozens of kingdoms and city-states. So we're not talking about extinction. We're talking about urban collapse, the abandonment of the great classic period cities and the social and political systems associated with them. What caused it? Theories of the collapse. Archaeologists have been debating the Maya collapse for over a century. Let's look at the main theories. Theory 1. Drought and climate change. This has become the leading explanation, supported by multiple lines of evidence. Not just one drought, but multiple drought periods around 810 CE, 860 CE, and 910 CE. These weren't ordinary dry years. These were megadroughts, some of the worst in the past 7,000 years in the region. Reservoirs dried up, crops failed, the agricultural surplus that supported city life disappeared. People couldn't feed themselves in the densely populated urban centers. Theory 2. Environmental degradation. The Maya weren't just victims of climate change, they may have made it worse through their own actions. To support millions of people in the jungle, the Maya cleared vast areas of forest for agriculture. They built cities, which required massive amounts of wood and limestone. To make the plaster coating their buildings, they needed to heat limestone to high temperatures, which required even more wood as fuel. Deforestation caused soil erosion. Without forest cover, the thin tropical soil washed away. This made agriculture harder and may have even affected local climate, reducing rainfall further. Analysis of lake sediments shows massive erosion during the Classic period. The Maya were literally consuming the land that sustained them. Theory 3. Warfare and political instability. Maya city-states fought each other constantly. Warfare intensified during the 8th and 9th centuries. Defensive walls began appearing around cities previously rare in Maya architecture. Iconography increasingly focused on warfare and captive sacrifice. As resources became scarce due to drought and environmental problems, competition intensified. Warfare became more destructive. Trade networks broke down. The cooperative systems that allowed cities to thrive collapsed into conflict. Some sites show evidence of violent destruction. The royal palace at Conquen was burned, and dozens of nobles were massacred and thrown into a cistern. This was during the collapse period. Theory 4. Social upheaval. Some researchers propose that the Maya collapse was fundamentally social, a loss of faith in the divine kingship that legitimized the ruling class. Maya kings claimed to communicate with the gods to ensure rain and fertility through ritual. When the droughts came and crops failed despite the rituals, maybe people stopped believing. Maybe they overthrew their kings. Maybe the social contract that bound the civilization together unraveled. There's some evidence for this: defaced monuments, desecrated royal burials, elite residences that were destroyed, signs of internal conflict between the ruling class and commoners. Theory 5. Disease and epidemics? Some researchers point to evidence of declining health during this period. Malnutrition made people vulnerable to disease. Crowded urban conditions facilitated epidemic spread. Yellow fever, malaria, and other tropical diseases might have devastated populations weakened by hunger. This is probably more of an accelerating factor than a root cause. The cascading collapse. The truth, as with the Indus Valley, is probably a combination of all these factors creating a cascading collapse. Here's how it might have unfolded. Climate change brings severe drought. Crops fail. The agricultural surplus that supported specialists, craftsmen, priests, administrators disappears. Cities can't feed their populations. But the kings continue performing expensive rituals, building monuments, and waging wars to demonstrate their power and maintain their legitimacy. This drains resources further. Desperate to feed people, the Maya clear more forest, plant in marginal areas, intensify agriculture beyond what the land can sustain. This works short-term but causes long-term environmental degradation. When the next drought hits, the degraded environment can't recover. Yields crash even harder. Starvation becomes widespread. People lose faith in rulers who can't solve the crisis. Social order breaks down. Warfare intensifies as city-states fight over dwindling resources. Trade networks collapse. The economic system that tied the civilization together fails. Disease spreads through malnourished, stressed populations. More people die or flee. The complex social and political systems that took centuries to develop, the scribal traditions, the astronomical knowledge, the long-distance trade networks, the political alliances all require stability and surplus to maintain. When those disappear, the systems collapse. Within a few generations, cities that took centuries to build are abandoned. The jungle reclaims them, but again, this wasn't extinction. Maya people survived, adapted, and continued. The northern cities thrived for centuries more. When they eventually declined, it was a different process related to different circumstances. What collapsed was a specific type of political and social organization. The classic Maya kingdom system centered on divine kingship and monumental architecture. The Maya collapse teaches us something crucial. You can be brilliant, sophisticated, and successful for centuries. But if your civilization is built on unsustainable practices and you can't adapt when conditions change, all that brilliance won't save you. The Maya weren't stupid, they were incredibly smart. But they built a civilization that required specific environmental conditions to function. When those conditions changed, the system was too rigid to adapt. Or maybe it did adapt by decentralizing, by abandoning the unsustainable urban model, by moving to areas with better water access. Maybe what we call collapse was actually successful adaptation by the people, even as their cities died. Either way, when explorers rediscovered the great Maya cities in the 19th century, they found them buried under jungle, their inscriptions unreadable, their history forgotten even by the Maya's own descendants. Until archaeology and decipherment revealed their story. A story of brilliance and hubris, achievement and catastrophe. A warning from the past about the fragility of even the greatest civilizations. Chapter 3. The Göbekli Tepe Mystery. Discovering the impossible. Now we're going to talk about something even stranger. A place that shouldn't exist according to everything we thought we knew about human history. Göbekli Tepe. The name means potbelly hill in Turkish. It's located in southeastern Turkey near the Syrian border, and it's rewriting our understanding of human civilization. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating Göbekli Tepe in 1995, he thought he was investigating a medieval cemetery. What he found instead was impossible: massive stone pillars arranged in circles, some weighing over 10 tons, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals: lions, foxes, snakes, vultures, scorpions, wild boars, decorated with abstract symbols. Built with sophisticated engineering, and old, incredibly old. The oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe date to approximately 9600 BCE. Let me repeat that: 9600 BCE, almost 12,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, Göbekli Tepe is older than pottery, older than metalworking, older than the wheel, older than writing. It's twice as old as the pyramids of Egypt. It's 3 times older than Stonehenge. It was built at the end of the Ice Age, during the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic period, at a time when humans were supposedly hunter-gatherers living in small, mobile bands. At a time when we supposedly didn't have civilization, and yet someone built this. Multiple circular structures, each with massive T-shaped pillars arranged in rings. The largest pillars stand 16 feet tall and weigh 10 tons. They were quarried from bedrock, carved, transported, and erected without metal tools or draft animals. This required organization, planning, a large labor force, specialized skills. All things we didn't think existed in 9600 BCE when Schmidt first published his findings. Many archaeologists were skeptical. It was too old, too sophisticated, too different from everything we knew about that period. But the dating was confirmed by multiple methods: radiocarbon dating of organic materials, geomagnetic surveys, stylistic analysis comparing Göbekli Tepe to other sites. Every method confirmed the same impossibly early date. Göbekli Tepe is real. It exists, and it shouldn't. What we know about Göbekli Tepe. Let's talk about what Göbekli Tepe actually is, because it's unlike anything else from its time period. The site consists of multiple circular structures built at different times over about 1,500 years. The oldest layers, Layer 3, date from roughly 9,600 to 8,800 BCE. Layer 2, built on top, dates from 8,800 to 8,000 BCE. Each structure is a circular or oval ring of massive T-shaped pillars. These pillars are megalithic, meaning single massive stones. They were quarried from limestone bedrock about a quarter-mile away, shaped into T-forms, carved with reliefs, then transported and erected. The T-shape seems to represent a stylized human form. The top of the T is the head, the vertical part is the body. Some pillars have arms carved on them, some have belts. They might be representations of ancestors, gods, or mythological beings. The carvings on the pillars are extraordinary. We see animals carved in high relief: foxes, wild boars or ox, extinct wild cattle, gazelles, donkeys, snakes, insects, arachnids, birds including vultures and cranes. The level of artistic skill is remarkable, but there are no plants depicted. And interestingly, no prey animals like deer or rabbits. The animals shown are dangerous or symbolic: predators, scavengers, venomous creatures. Some carvings show human figures without heads. Some show geometric symbols that might be proto-writing or symbolic notation, though we can't read them. The structures aren't residential. There's no evidence people lived here. No domestic architecture, no hearths, no trash middens from daily life. This was a special place, a ritual center. A temple, though that word might not quite capture what it was. And here is something remarkable. After each structure was used for a period, perhaps decades or centuries, it was deliberately buried. Not destroyed, not abandoned, carefully filled in with tons of debris and covered over. Then they built a new structure on top or nearby and eventually buried that too. This went on for 1,500 years. Build, use, bury, repeat. Finally, around 8,000 BCE, the entire site was permanently buried and abandoned. The massive pillars, the carved reliefs, everything was carefully covered with debris and soil, and then forgotten for 10,000 years. Why? We have no idea. The mystery of who built it. Here's the central mystery: who built Göbekli Tepe and how? The standard narrative of human history says that civilization began with agriculture. People started farming, which created surplus food, which allowed specialization and the development of complex societies. Agriculture led to permanent settlements, which led to cities, which led to civilization. Göbekli Tepe flips this narrative upside down. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. The site predates agriculture in this region by over 1,000 years. These weren't farmers. They had no domestic animals except possibly dogs. They hunted wild game and gathered wild plants, yet they built this. A massive ritual complex that required thousands of hours of labor. Moving 10-ton stones without draft animals. Carving elaborate reliefs without metal tools. Coordinating hundreds or thousands of people in a sustained construction project. How did hunter-gatherers do this? Traditional archaeology said they couldn't. Small, mobile bands of foragers don't have the population, the social organization, or the surplus resources for monumental architecture. That requires agriculture, permanent settlements, social hierarchy, and surplus production. But Göbekli Tepe proves they did. Somehow, this has led to some revolutionary thinking about the origins of civilization. Maybe agriculture didn't cause civilization? Maybe civilization or proto-civilization came first. Maybe the need to build and maintain places like Göbekli Tepe to gather regularly for rituals and ceremonies drove people to develop agriculture so they could stay in one place and feed larger populations. Maybe religion came before cities. Maybe our drive to build sacred spaces and gather in large groups for shared rituals was what pushed us toward the social complexity we call civilization. Schmidt believed Göbekli Tepe was built by a cult of the skull. He found skull fragments that had been carved and plastered, possibly used in rituals. The headless human figures on the pillars might relate to this. Some kind of ancestor worship or death cult might have motivated construction. But this is speculation. We don't know what religion or beliefs the builders held. We don't even know what they called themselves. What we do know is that multiple groups of hunter-gatherers from a wide area came together repeatedly over 1,500 years to build and maintain this site. They shared symbolic systems, the same types of carvings appear across multiple structures. They had social mechanisms for organizing large-scale labor. They valued this place enough to invest enormous effort in it, and then they buried it all and walked away. Why it was abandoned. Here's where the disappeared without explanation part really kicks in. Around 8000 BCE, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried and abandoned, not destroyed, not gradually falling into ruin, intentionally filled in and covered. At roughly the same time, the region was undergoing the Neolithic Revolution. People were starting to domesticate plants and animals. Permanent settlements were being established. Agriculture was beginning. Some researchers think the two are related. As people transitioned from hunting and gathering to farming, perhaps the old ritual center lost its meaning. Maybe Göbekli Tepe represented the worldview of hunter-gatherers, and farming societies needed different sacred spaces. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe Göbekli Tepe became too sacred, too powerful, too dangerous. Maybe there was a religious revolution, and the old temple had to be ritually killed by burial. We find no evidence of violence, no destruction, no signs that it was abandoned in crisis. It seems deliberate, planned, ceremonial. And then it was forgotten, completely, for 10,000 years, until a survey in the 1960s noted some interesting stones, and Klaus Schmidt decided to dig. Even more mysterious, Göbekli Tepe isn't unique anymore. We're now finding similar sites throughout the region. Karahan Tepe, Seberk, and others, all from the same period, all showing similar architecture and symbolism, all eventually buried and abandoned. This suggests Göbekli Tepe wasn't an anomaly, but part of a wider cultural phenomenon we're only beginning to understand. There was something happening in southeastern Turkey and northern Mesopotamia at the end of the Ice Age, a flowering of ritual architecture and symbolic expression among hunter-gatherer groups. And then it ended as agriculture took hold. These massive stone temples were buried. The knowledge of how to build them, the reasons for building them, the beliefs that motivated them, all apparently lost. When cities arose in Mesopotamia 5,000 years later, there's no evident connection to Göbekli Tepe. It's as if that entire tradition was erased from cultural memory. Göbekli Tepe represents a mysterious chapter in human history that we're only beginning to read. It tells us that our ancestors were more sophisticated, more capable, and more mysterious than we imagined. It also tells us that civilizations or proto-civilizations cannot just collapse but be deliberately erased. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe didn't want future generations to know about it. They wanted it forgotten, and they succeeded. For 10,000 years, discovering the impossible. Now we're going to talk about something even stranger. A place that shouldn't exist according to everything we thought we knew about human history. Göbekli Tepe. The name means potbelly hill in Turkish. It's located in southeastern Turkey near the Syrian border, and it's rewriting our understanding of human civilization. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating Göbekli Tepe in 1995, he thought he was investigating a medieval cemetery. What he found instead was impossible. Massive stone pillars arranged in circles, some weighing over 10 tons. Carved with elaborate reliefs of animals, lions, foxes, snakes, vultures, scorpions, wild boars, decorated with abstract symbols. Built with sophisticated engineering, and old, incredibly old. The oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe date to approximately 9600 BCE. Let me repeat that, 9600 BCE, almost 12,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, Göbekli Tepe is older than pottery, older than metalworking, older than the wheel, older than writing. It's twice as old as the pyramids of Egypt. It's 3 times older than Stonehenge. It was built at the end of the Ice Age, during the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic period, at a time when humans were supposedly hunter-gatherers living in small, mobile bands, at a time when we supposedly didn't have civilization, and yet someone built this. Multiple circular structures, each with massive T-shaped pillars arranged in rings. The largest pillars stand 16 feet tall and weigh 10 tons. They were quarried from bedrock, carved, transported, and erected without metal tools or draft animals. This required organization, planning, a large labor force, specialized skills. All things we didn't think existed in 9600 BC when Schmidt first published his findings. Many archaeologists were skeptical. It was too old, too sophisticated, too different from everything we knew about that period. But the dating was confirmed by multiple methods. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials, geomagnetic surveys, stylistic analysis comparing Göbekli Tepe to other sites. Every method confirmed the same impossibly early date. Göbekli Tepe is real. It exists, and it shouldn't. What we know about Göbekli Tepe. Let's talk about what Göbekli Tepe actually is, because it's unlike anything else from its time period. The site consists of multiple circular structures built at different times over about 1,500 years. The oldest layers, Layer 3, date from roughly 9,600 to 8,800 BCE. Layer 2, built on top, dates from 8,800 to 8,000 BCE. Each structure is a circular or oval ring of massive T-shaped pillars. These pillars are megalithic, meaning single massive stones. They were quarried from limestone bedrock about a quarter-mile away, shaped into T-forms, carved with reliefs, then transported and erected. The T shape seems to represent a stylized human form. The top of the T is the head, the vertical part is the body. Some pillars have arms carved on them, some have belts. They might be representations of ancestors, gods, or mythological beings. The carvings on the pillars are extraordinary. We see animals carved in high relief, foxes, wild boars or ox, extinct wild cattle, gazelles, donkeys, snakes, insects, arachnids, birds including vultures, and cranes. The level of artistic skill is remarkable, but there are no plants depicted. And interestingly, no prey animals like deer or rabbits. The animals shown are dangerous or symbolic, predators, scavengers, venomous creatures. Some carvings show human figures without heads. Some show geometric symbols that might be proto-writing or symbolic notation, though we can't read them. The structures aren't residential. There's no evidence people lived here. No domestic architecture, no hearths, no trash middens from daily life. This was a special place, a ritual center. A temple, though that word might not quite capture what it was. And here as something remarkable, after each structure was used for a period perhaps decades or centuries, it was deliberately buried. Not destroyed, not abandoned, carefully filled in with tons of debris and covered over. Then they built a new structure on top or nearby and eventually buried that too. This went on for 1,500 years. Build, use, bury, repeat. Finally, around 8000 BCE, the entire site was permanently buried and abandoned. The massive pillars, the carved reliefs, everything was carefully covered with debris and soil, and then forgotten for 10,000 years. Why? We have no idea. The mystery of who built it. Here's the central mystery. Who built Göbekli Tepe and how? The standard narrative of human history says that civilization began with agriculture. People started farming, which created surplus food, which allowed specialization and the development of complex societies. Agriculture led to permanent settlements, which led to cities, which led to civilization. Göbekli Tepe flips this narrative upside down. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. The site predates agriculture in this region by over 1,000 years. These weren't farmers. They had no domestic animals except possibly dogs. They hunted wild game and gathered wild plants, yet they built this. A massive ritual complex that required thousands of hours of labor. Moving 10-ton stones without draft animals. Carving elaborate reliefs without metal tools. Coordinating hundreds or thousands of people in a sustained construction project. How did hunter-gatherers do this? Traditional archaeology said they couldn't. Small, mobile bands of foragers don't have the population, the social organization, or the surplus resources for monumental architecture. That requires agriculture, permanent settlements, social hierarchy, and surplus production. But Göbekli Tepe proves they did. Somehow, this has led to some revolutionary thinking about the origins of civilization. Maybe agriculture didn't cause civilization? Maybe civilization or proto-civilization came first. Maybe the need to build and maintain places like Göbekli Tepe to gather regularly for rituals and ceremonies drove people to develop agriculture so they could stay in one place and feed larger populations. Maybe religion came before cities. Maybe our drive to build sacred spaces and gather in large groups for shared rituals was what pushed us toward the social complexity we call civilization. Schmidt believed Göbekli Tepe was built by a cult of the skull. The headless human figures on the pillars might relate to this. Some kind of ancestor worship or death cult might have motivated construction. But this is speculation. We don't know what religion or beliefs the builders held. We don't even know what they called themselves. What we do know is that multiple groups of hunter-gatherers from a wide area came together repeatedly over 1,500 years to build and maintain this site. They shared symbolic systems, the same types of carvings appear across multiple structures. They had social mechanisms for organizing large-scale labor. They valued this place enough to invest enormous effort in it, and then they buried it all and walked away. Why it was abandoned? Here's where the disappeared without explanation part really kicks in. Around 8000 BCE, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried and abandoned. Not destroyed, not gradually falling into ruin. Intentionally filled in and covered. At roughly the same time, the region was undergoing the Neolithic Revolution. People were starting to domesticate plants and animals. Permanent settlements were being established. Agriculture was beginning. Some researchers think the two are related. As people transitioned from hunting and gathering to farming, perhaps the old ritual center lost its meaning. Maybe Göbekli Tepe represented the worldview of hunter-gatherers, and farming societies needed different sacred spaces. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe Göbekli Tepe became too sacred, too powerful, too dangerous? Maybe there was a religious revolution, and the old temple had to be ritually killed by burial. We find no evidence of violence, no destruction, no signs that it was abandoned in crisis. It seems deliberate, planned, ceremonial. And then it was forgotten, completely, for 10,000 years, until a survey in the 1960s noted some interesting stones, and Klaus Schmidt decided to dig. Even more mysterious, Göbekli Tepe isn't unique anymore. We're now finding similar sites throughout the region. Karahan Tepe, Saybirk, and others. This suggests Göbekli Tepe wasn't an anomaly, but part of a wider cultural phenomenon we're only beginning to understand. There was something happening in southeastern Turkey and northern Mesopotamia at the end of the Ice Age, a flowering of ritual architecture and symbolic expression among hunter-gatherer groups. And then it ended as agriculture took hold. These massive stone temples were buried. When cities arose in Mesopotamia 5,000 years later, there's no evident connection to Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe represents a mysterious chapter in human history that we're only beginning to read. It tells us that our ancestors were more sophisticated, more capable, and more mysterious than we imagined. It also tells us that civilizations or proto-civilizations can not just collapse but be deliberately erased. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe didn't want future generations to know about it. They wanted it forgotten, and they succeeded. For 10,000 years. Chapter 4. The Sea Peoples. The Bronze Age Collapse. Now we're going to talk about one of the most dramatic collapses in history. And unlike our previous examples, this one took down not just one civilization, but an entire interconnected world. The Late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, was a period of unprecedented interconnection in the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. Diplomats exchanged letters in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the time. Princes married foreign princesses to cement alliances. It was sophisticated, prosperous, and stable until it wasn't. We know they existed because multiple sources mention them. We know they were devastating because of the destruction they left behind. But we don't know who they really were, where they came from, or what happened to them. Our best source is Egyptian inscriptions, particularly the temple at Medinet Habu, where Ramesses III documented his victories. The reliefs show naval battles and land warfare. The hieroglyphic texts list names of the groups that attacked Egypt. According to these texts, the Sea Peoples weren't a single unified force. They were a coalition of different groups with names the Egyptians recorded phonetically: the Peliset, Jeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, and others. Some of these names might be familiar. The Peliset might be the Philistines who later settled in Canaan. The Shekelesh might be related to Sicily. The Denyen might be connected to the Greek Danaans. But these identifications are uncertain. What we know from Egyptian texts and archaeological evidence, they came by sea in large fleets. They weren't just raiders but migrants traveling with families, possessions, and ox carts. This was a mass movement of people, not just military expeditions. The king writes that his army is away, his ships are scattered, and the enemy is about to attack. That's the last we hear from Ugarit. The city was burned and never rebuilt. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, shows signs of deliberate destruction and abandonment. Whether the Sea Peoples destroyed it or whether the Hittites themselves abandoned it as their empire collapsed is debated. Either way, the city died around 1200 BC Troy. The famous city of Troyvia was destroyed by fire around 1180 BCE. Whether this was the Trojan War of legend or an attack by Sea Peoples or just the general chaos of the time, we don't know. But the timing fits. Mycenae and other Greek centers, palace after palace in Greece, shows destruction layers from this period. The bureaucratic system collapsed. Writing disappeared. Trade stopped. Population plummeted. Levantan cities, numerous cities in what is now Lebanon, Israel, and Syria were destroyed. Some were rebuilt smaller, others were abandoned permanently. The scale of destruction is staggering. This wasn't localized conflict. This was a region-wide catastrophe affecting millions of people across thousands of miles. Egypt recorded fighting off the Sea Peoples in 3 major campaigns during the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III. They claimed victories, and Egypt did survive, but the wars were costly. Egypt's power was broken, its empire dissolved. The Bronze Age world was gone. Alternative theories. Modern scholars debate whether the Sea Peoples were really the primary cause of the Bronze Age collapse or whether they were a symptom of deeper problems. Theory 1. Climate change and famine. Climate data shows severe drought across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. This was part of the same event that affected the Maya, much later a pattern of reduced rainfall that lasted decades. Crops failed, famine spread, the agricultural surplus that supported Bronze Age kingdoms disappeared. Letters from this period mention famine and requests for grain shipments. Hungry, desperate people become refugees and raiders. Raiders attacked weakened kingdoms. Everything reinforced everything else. The Sea Peoples were real. We have too much evidence to dismiss them as fiction. Chapter 5: Easter Island Decline. The most isolated civilization. For our final case study, we're going to the most remote inhabited island on Earth, Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as its indigenous people call it. Easter Island is tiny, just 64 square miles, and extraordinarily isolated. It's 2,300 miles west of Chile, 2,500 miles east of Tahiti. The nearest inhabited island is Pitcairn, 1,200 miles away. When the Polynesians who first settled Easter Island arrived, probably around 1200 CE, they were more isolated than any other human society in history. For centuries, they lived in complete isolation. No trade, no contact with other peoples, no outside resources. Whatever they built with what the island provided. And what they built was extraordinary. Nearly 900 giant stone statues called moai, some weighing up to 80 tons, quarried from volcanic rock, transported across the island, and erected on massive stone platforms called ahu. The moai are iconic, mysterious stone faces staring inland as if watching over the people. They represent ancestors and chiefs, carved with distinctive elongated heads and prominent brows. Creating them required sophisticated stone working skills, social organization, and massive labor investment. The largest moai ever carved, still in the quarry, would have weighed over 150 tons and stood 70 feet tall if completed. Moving and erecting these statues was an engineering feat. At its peak, Easter Island's population may have reached 15,000 people. They developed their own unique culture, their own art style, and rongorongo, possibly the only indigenous writing system in the Pacific. But when Europeans first arrived in 1722, they found an island in ruins. Most moai had been toppled. The population was perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people, living in poverty and strife. The trees were gone. The civilization that built the statues had collapsed. What happened? This is the Easter Island decline, and it's been held up as the ultimate cautionary tale about environmental destruction. But the real story is more complex. The traditional narrative, the traditional story of Easter Island collapse goes like this. The Polynesians arrived around 1200 CE and found a subtropical paradise. The island was covered in palm forest, with large trees similar to Chilean wine palms. Birds nested in abundance. The soil was fertile. The climate was mild. The population grew rapidly. They developed a complex society with chiefs, priests, and specialized craftsmen. Different clans controlled different regions of the island. They began carving moai to honor their ancestors. Building these statues became competitive, each clan trying to build larger and more impressive moai than their rivals. The statues became status symbols, demonstrations of chiefly power. But moving the giant statues required wood, lots of it. They needed logs to use as rollers, rope made from tree bark, levers, and scaffolding for erection. Every statue required trees. They also needed wood for fuel, for building boats, for housing, for cremation, for cooking. As the population grew, wood consumption increased? Slowly, systematically, they cut down the forest, all of it. The last palm tree on Easter Island died around 1650 CE without trees, soil eroded. Crop yields declined. They couldn't build boats for fishing. Bird populations collapsed as nesting sites disappeared, protein sources vanished, famine struck. The social order broke down, warfare erupted between clans. In their desperation and rage, they toppled each other's moai. The sacred ancestors were thrown down, broken, desecrated. The civilization collapsed into violence and starvation. When Europeans arrived, they found the survivors living in the wreckage of their once great culture. This narrative, popularized by scholars like Jared Diamond in Collapse, became the definitive cautionary tale, a civilization that destroyed its environment and paid the ultimate price, ecocide as suicide. But recent research has complicated this story significantly. The revised understanding. Let's look at what modern archaeology and anthropology have revealed. First, the rats. When Polynesians colonized Easter Island, they brought rats with them, Polynesian rats, a species that came with all Polynesian voyagers. These rats, in the absence of natural predators, exploded in population. Easter Island palm nuts preserved in caves show rat tooth marks. The rats ate the seeds, preventing forest regeneration. Analysis suggests that rats might have been more responsible for deforestation than humans cutting down trees. This doesn't completely exonerate humans. Humans brought the rats and created conditions for their population explosion, but it complicates the idea of deliberate environmental destruction. Second, the evidence for violence. The traditional narrative depicts catastrophic warfare with widespread violence and even cannibalism. But careful re-examination of skeletal remains shows much less violence than previously claimed. The weapons found, obsidian spear points called mata, were probably more for ritual combat and status display than mass warfare. While there was certainly conflict, particularly in the late period, it might not have been as apocalyptic as depicted. Third, the population estimates. Recent research suggests the population never reached 15,000. More realistic estimates put the peak population around 3,000 to 4,000. This changes the ecological impact significantly. Fewer people means less resource consumption, less pressure on the environment. Fourth, European impact. The traditional collapse narrative ends when Europeans arrive, but that's misleading. European contact devastated Easter Island far more than environmental change ever did. European ships brought diseases, smallpox, tuberculosis, syphilis that killed huge numbers of people. In 1862 to 1863, Peruvian slave raiders kidnapped about 1,500 Easter Islanders, roughly half the population. Most died in Peru, and those who returned brought more diseases. By 1877, only 111 people remained alive on Easter Island. This wasn't environmental collapse. This was colonial genocide. Fifth, the agricultural system. We now know the Easter Islanders practiced sophisticated rock gardening using mulch and stone arrangements to protect soil and crops. They shifted to more sustainable agricultural practices after deforestation. Life was harder, but they adapted. What really happened? So, what's the real story of Easter Island decline? It's a story of adaptation as much as collapse. Yes, the forests were lost. Yes, this was partly due to human activity and partly due to the rats humans brought. Yes, this changed Easter Island society fundamentally, but the people didn't die out. They didn't collapse into anarchic violence. They adapted. They couldn't build boats anymore, so they stopped fishing offshore and focused on nearshore resources and agriculture. They developed the rock garden agricultural system. They shifted their protein sources to chickens, which they raised intensively. The moai carving did eventually stop, probably because moving the statues without wood became impossible. The competitive statue building that drove the earlier society ended. That cultural system collapsed, but new systems emerged. Birdman cult ceremonialism replaced moai building as the primary religious and political focus. Instead of building bigger statues, clans competed in annual rituals involving swimming to offshore rocks to collect seabird eggs. The winner became the Birdman for the year, gaining spiritual authority. This was adaptation, not apocalypse. The real catastrophe was European contact. Diseases, slavery, land appropriation, and cultural destruction devastated the population far more than environmental change ever did. By the time anthropologists began studying Easter Island seriously in the early 20th century, most of the original culture was gone. The Rongorongo script could no longer be read. Everyone who knew how had died in the epidemics or been taken by slave raiders. The oral traditions were fragmented. The population was a tiny remnant. The ruins they saw, the toppled moai, the deforested landscape, the impoverished population were as much the result of colonialism as environmental mismanagement. So, is Easter Island still a cautionary tale? Yes, but a different one. It shows that even in isolation, with limited resources, humans can survive and adapt if they're flexible. The Easter Islanders did overexploit their environment, but they also developed new strategies for survival when old ones failed. It also shows how vulnerable small, isolated populations are to outside shocks. When diseases and slavers came, there was no escape, no refuge, no possibility of recovery. Perhaps most importantly, it shows how easy it is to misinterpret ruins. For decades, scholars looked at fallen statues and saw evidence of societal suicide. More careful analysis revealed a different story, one of resilience interrupted by external catastrophe. The lesson isn't just don't cut down all your trees, though that's certainly part of it. The lesson is more nuanced. Societies can adapt to environmental change, but they're vulnerable to cascading failures, especially when external pressures combine with internal stresses. Easter Island didn't disappear. Its people survived, endured, and persist today. But the civilization that built the moai did end, transformed by environmental change and, ultimately, destroyed by colonialism. It's a story not of simple ecological collapse, but of adaptation, resilience, and ultimately, conquest. Chapter 6: Climate and Human Factors, the Common Threads. Looking across the collapses, we've examined 5 very different civilizations that disappeared or transformed dramatically. The Indus Valley Civilization, with its sophisticated urban planning, deurbanizing, and dispersing. The classic Maya, whose cities were swallowed by jungle as their population collapsed. Göbekli Tepe, deliberately buried by its builders and forgotten for 10 millennia. The Bronze Age world, destroyed in a cascade of failures associated with the Sea Peoples. Easter Island, deforested and transformed, its population devastated by colonialism. These are very different cases, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles. But when we look closely, common patterns emerge. Every single one of these collapses involved environmental stress. Every single one involved some form of climate change or environmental degradation. And every single one involved complex interactions between environmental, social, and political factors. Let's break down the common threads. Climate change as a stressor. Climate change appears in every single collapse we've examined. The Indus Valley faced the 4.2 kiloyear event, a megadrought that weakened monsoons and dried up rivers. Crops failed, famine spread, the stable climate that had supported Bronze Age civilization changed. Even Easter Island's deforestation was influenced by climate. The island became drier after about 1400 CE, making forest regeneration harder even if rats and humans hadn't been pressuring the trees. Here's what's crucial to understand. These weren't extreme climate changes. When that environment shifts, even modestly, highly optimized systems become brittle. a farming technique that works perfectly with normal rainfall fails with slightly less rain. A city placement that makes sense with certain river flow becomes indefensible when the river shifts or dries up. Trade routes that work in stable conditions break down when climate stress creates conflict. The more specialized and optimized a civilization becomes, the more vulnerable it is to environmental change. Environmental degradation, but it wasn't just climate change. In every case, humans made their environmental problems worse through their own actions. The Bronze Age civilizations, while not directly causing environmental collapse, had created economic systems so specialized and interdependent that they couldn't adapt when environmental stress hit. They'd optimized for maximum efficiency at the cost of resilience. This is a pattern. Short-term success through environmental exploitation leads to long-term vulnerability. The agricultural intensification that allows population growth also degrades the land. The urbanization that concentrates power and culture also concentrates environmental impact. The trade networks that bring prosperity also create dependencies. Civilizations prosper by using resources. But using resources changes the environment, and if civilizations don't account for those changes, they create the conditions for their own collapse. Social and political factors. Environmental stress doesn't automatically cause collapse. It creates challenges that societies must respond to. How they respond depends on their social and political structures. In the Indus Valley, we see a relatively peaceful decline. People migrated away from cities that could no longer support them. There's minimal evidence of violence or social breakdown. The lack of apparent hierarchy might have actually helped no kings desperately clinging to power, no elites exploiting commoners as resources declined. The Maya collapse involved much more conflict. The elaborate systems of divine kingship, competitive monument building, and intercity warfare drained resources that might have gone to adaptation. Kings needed to demonstrate power through rituals and wars, even as resources declined. This inflexibility made adaptation harder. The Bronze Age systems were so specialized and hierarchical that when trade networks failed, entire economic systems collapsed. The palace economies of the Bronze Age couldn't function without long-distance trade. When that broke down, they had nothing to fall back on. Easter Island's competitive Moai building drove resource consumption for status display rather than practical need. Clans competed through monument building, intensifying environmental pressure. In every case, the structure of society influenced how it responded to environmental stress. Rigid hierarchies, competitive status displays, and over-specialized economies made adaptation harder. Societies that were more flexible, less hierarchical, and less dependent on specific resources had better chances of survival. This is crucial. Environmental problems don't exist in a vacuum. They interact with social, political, and economic structures. Sometimes those structures help societies adapt. Often, they make problems worse. The role of complexity. Archaeologist Joseph Tainter proposed a theory of collapse based on complexity. As societies face challenges, they solve them by becoming more complex, developing new technologies, creating specialized roles, building larger administrative structures. This works for a long time. Complexity allows societies to do amazing things. Build great cities, support large populations, create art, science, and culture, but complexity has costs. It requires energy to maintain. It creates dependencies. It makes systems more interconnected, so failures cascade more easily. Eventually, Tainter argues the costs of complexity exceed the benefits. Adding more complexity yields diminishing returns. The society becomes so complicated, so interdependent, so specialized that it can't adapt to new challenges. It becomes brittle. When stress hits climate change, resource depletion, invasion, the complex system can't respond flexibly. It's optimized for old conditions. Adaptation would require dismantling parts of the system, which the system resists. So instead of adapting, the system fails. Sometimes catastrophically. This fits what we see in our case studies. The Indus Valley, the Maya, the Bronze Age civilizations all were highly complex, with specialized economies, elaborate social hierarchies, sophisticated technologies. That complexity allowed their greatness. It also made them vulnerable. When they faced environmental stress, they couldn't simplify fast enough to survive intact. Göbekli Tepe is fascinating in this context. It represents complexity without full civilization, a ritual complex built by hunter-gatherers. When it no longer served its purpose, they literally buried it and walked away. No collapse, just abandonment. The flexibility of hunter-gatherer societies allowed this. The civilizations that rose later couldn't do this. They were too invested in their complexity, too dependent on their specialized systems. When those systems failed, the civilizations failed. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson from these collapses. Success creates the conditions for failure. The very achievements that make civilizations great, the cities, the art, the specialization, the complexity, also make them vulnerable to collapse when conditions change. Conclusion. Lessons for the present. Why study collapsed civilizations? Why does any of this matter? Why spend time examining civilizations that vanished centuries or millennia ago? Because we're not so different. Our civilization is more complex than any that came before. We're more specialized, more interconnected, more dependent on specific environmental conditions. Weather patterns are shifting. Droughts are intensifying in some regions, floods in others. Sea levels are rising. Ecosystems are changing. We're also causing environmental degradation. Soil depletion, deforestation, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss. The list is long and sobering. Like the Maya clearing forests or the Indus Valley people degrading their soil, we're changing our environment in ways that might not be sustainable. Lesson 1. Environmental change can happen faster than social adaptation. Social, political, and economic systems change slowly. They have inertia. By the time societies recognized the severity of their problems, they were often already in crisis. We have an advantage. We can see our environmental problems coming. We have climate science, predictive modeling, and global communication. But we also have the disadvantage of scale. Our problems are bigger, and our systems are more complex and harder to change. Lesson 2. Complexity is both strength and vulnerability. The sophistication of modern civilization, our technology, our global economy, our specialized knowledge gives us capabilities past societies couldn't imagine. But it also creates dependencies and vulnerabilities. When supply chains break, modern societies struggle. When energy systems fail, entire economies can collapse. When climate change affects one region, it ripples through the global system. We need to build resilience, not just efficiency. We need backup systems, flexibility, and the ability to simplify when necessary. Redundancy isn't waste, it's insurance. Lesson 3. Social structure matters as much as environment. The Indus Valley's relatively peaceful decline versus the Maya's violent collapse shows that how societies are organized influences how they respond to stress. Rigid hierarchies, extreme inequality, and systems that benefit elites at the expense of the majority make adaptation harder. When resources decline, do societies pull together or tear apart? Do they innovate or cling desperately to the old ways? Our social and political choices matter. Building equitable, flexible societies isn't just morally right, it's practically necessary for long-term survival. Lesson 4. We're not as smart as we think. Every collapsed civilization was, in its time, the pinnacle of human achievement. The Indus Valley cities were marvels of engineering. The Maya understood astronomy as well as medieval Europeans. The Bronze Age kingdoms commanded resources and knowledge that seemed unassailable. They all thought they were permanent. They all believed their systems would endure. They were all wrong. Civilizations can collapse without their people disappearing. Complex systems can fail without human extinction. Sometimes collapse is actually adaptation, a shift to different, simpler, more sustainable ways of living. This doesn't mean collapse is good. The suffering involved in civilizational collapse is immense. Knowledge is lost. Generations endure poverty and violence. But it means humans are resilient. We can survive catastrophic changes if we're flexible and creative. The question is whether we can adapt without the collapse, without the immense suffering that comes with it. The final question. So here's the question these vanished civilizations pose to us. Will we learn from them or repeat their mistakes? We have advantages they didn't. We have historical perspective. We can see what happened to them and why. We have global communication and cooperation. We have scientific understanding of environmental systems. We have technologies they couldn't imagine. But we also have disadvantages. Our problems are global, not local. Our systems are more complex and interdependent. Our population is far larger. Our environmental impact is orders of magnitude greater. And we have the same human psychology that led past civilizations to disaster. The same tendency to prioritize short-term gains over long-term sustainability. The same difficulty in changing established systems. The same conflicts between competing groups. The same hubris. The Indus Valley, the Maya, the Bronze Age civilizations, Göbekli Tepe, Easter Island, they all tell us that civilizations can end. That societies that seem permanent and powerful can collapse. That environmental stress combined with social and political problems can bring down even the greatest achievements, but they also tell us that humans persist. That we adapt and survive, that endings can be beginnings. That from ruins, new societies emerge. The civilizations we've explored didn't disappear without explanation. Thank you for joining me on this journey through humanity's lost civilizations. These stories are sobering, but they're also important. They remind us that nothing is permanent, that even the greatest societies can fail, but also that humans are remarkably resilient and adaptable. If this video made you think, if it changed how you see our present challenges, if it gave you a deeper appreciation for the fragility and resilience of human civilization, then it's served its purpose. Let me know in the comments, which of these collapsed civilizations fascinates you most? What lessons do you think are most relevant to our modern world? What other ancient mysteries should we explore? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. Until next time, remember, we're all standing on the ruins of countless civilizations that came before. Let's make sure we're not building the next set of ruins. Stay curious, stay humble, and never stop learning from the past.